6 harrowing close calls, fierce encounters, and desperate fights for survival revealed the raw chaos of unexpected human-bear confrontations. From remote wilderness to bustling cities, these gripping stories dive into the terror of bear attacks that transform ordinary moments into life-or-death nightmares. Witness the fragile balance between man and nature unravel in these unforgettable tales. The forested hills of Wyoming had always been a haven for hikers, campers, and wildlife enthusiasts. Still, everything changed on July 17, 2024, when that tranquility was shattered by one of nature's fiercest predators, a creature maddened by starvation. The attack began at dawn near a popular hiking trail. A group of 5 hikers had camped by a stream, the gentle sound of water masking the approach of the crazed predator. The bear, driven mad by hunger after an uncharacteristically harsh winter, is struck with brutal efficiency. It tore through the nylon tents like paper, its claws slicing flesh and muscle. One hiker, caught mid-scream, was silenced instantly as the bear's jaws clamped down on his neck. Another tried to run but was dragged back, her cries echoing through the trees until they were abruptly cut off. The carnage was over in minutes, leaving only blood-soaked ground and silence. There were no witnesses except for the trees. The bear didn't linger. Its desperation seemed to fuel an almost supernatural speed. By mid-morning, it had traveled over 3 miles to a nearby family campsite. 12 people were scattered across the area preparing breakfast. A father flipping pancake turned at the sound of rustling foliage, only to be knocked to the ground by the full force of the grizzly's charge. He was dead before he could scream. Chaos erupted as the bear barreled through the site. Campers scrambled to escape, but there was nowhere to hide. The bear overturned tents, slashed through fabric and flesh alike, and left a trail of destruction in its wake. One woman climbed onto a picnic table, waving her arms in a futile attempt to deter the beast, only to be struck down with a single swipe. A mother clutching her toddler ran toward the tree line, hoping to escape. She stumbled, the child falling from her arms. The bear had closed the distance in the brief seconds it took her to recover. It snatched the child as the mother watched, frozen in horror. She screamed and threw herself at the animal, but it tossed her aside like a rag doll. The bear's eyes were wild, almost demonic, as if driven by something more than hunger, something that urged it to kill and then kill some more. By nightfall, the bear's path of terror stretched across a 10-mile radius. Reports of attacks poured in. A pair of hunters ambushed while cleaning a deer, a lone fisherman dragged from the water's edge, and a rural cabin broken into, its occupants slaughtered. Rangers and law enforcement scrambled to respond, but the remote terrain and the bear's unpredictable movements made it nearly impossible to track. At dawn on July 18th, the bear struck again, this time at a remote trailhead where 6 backpackers had spent the night. They had heard the warnings on the radio, but decided to press on, believing the chances of an encounter were slim. As they packed their gear, the bear emerged from the shadows. It roared a guttural sound that froze them in place and charged. The group scattered, some running into the forest, others scrambling uphill toward the cliffs. The bear's speed was unmatched. It caught one man by the ankle, dragging him screaming back down the slope. Another, trying to climb a tree, was pulled down and mauled. The survivors who managed to reach safety would later recount the haunting sound of bones snapping and cries fading into the distance. Mia Roberts, a 14-year-old girl, was among the last to encounter the bear. She had been hiking with her father, Mark, along a popular trail when they stumbled upon the aftermath of the previous attack. Shredded tents, scattered belongings, and a pool of blood that soaked the forest floor. Mark urged Mia to run, but the bear emerged from the trees before they could retreat. It was massive, its fur matted with blood and its eyes wild with rage. Mark stood his ground, yelling and waving his arms in a desperate attempt to protect his daughter. The bear charged. Mia turned and ran, her father's screams echoing behind her. The terrain was treacherous, with roots and fallen branches threatening to trip her at every step. She didn't dare look back, the bear's growls pushing her forward. Her lungs burned, and her legs felt like they would give out. But adrenaline kept Mia moving. She stumbled upon a narrow ravine and threw herself down the slope, landing hard on the rocky ground below. Bruised and bleeding, she crawled into a crevice between 2 boulders, pressing herself into the shadows. The bear arrived moments later, sniffing the air and pawing at the ground. Mia held her breath, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure the bear could hear it. After what felt like an eternity, the bear moved on. Mia waited hours before daring to emerge, and was later found by rangers, her account providing critical information that helped track the bear's movements. The grizzly was finally killed near a ranger outpost later that afternoon, its body riddled with tranquilizer darts and bullets. The sheer scale of its rampage shocked the nation, leading to widespread calls for stricter safety measures in bear country. A total of 50 people lost their lives to the beast. It was unheard of, a tragedy unlike anything the States had ever seen. For those who survived, the physical and emotional scars would remain a constant reminder of the fragility of life in the wilderness, of the things that lurk in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. The Canadian Rockies, cloaked in an early September mist, stood vast and imposing, their peaks cutting into a pale gray sky. For David Miller and his crew of 6, the wilderness was both a challenge and a muse. The valley they'd chosen for their base camp was remote and untouched, the perfect place to capture rare wildlife footage. Nestled between towering cliffs and thick spruce forests, it seemed almost too good to be true. They didn't know that they had ventured into the heart of a grizzly bear's territory. The team had arrived early that morning, unloading equipment and setting up camp near a stream. Cameras were positioned along game trails and drones buzzed overhead, mapping the landscape. Ever the perfectionist, David directed every movement, his mind already spinning with ideas for the documentary. By nightfall, the valley transformed. Shadows stretched long and dark, and the air grew cold. The crew gathered around a small fire, their laughter and the crackle of flames the only sounds breaking the silence. Just beyond the firelight, unseen eyes watched. The grizzly emerged from its den, a massive beast with a thick coat that rippled as it moved. The scent of humans and the disturbance of its home had roused it from sleep, its instincts on high alert. Slowly it stalked closer, its breath visible in the cold night air. David was the first to notice the bear, but there was no time to warn the others. In an instant, the bear charged. Chaos ensued as the crew scattered, but David knew this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. He signaled Katie, his assistant, to stick close. Then he raised his camera. The bear was getting closer by the second. David started running, camera still in hand, still raised. Katie followed closely, and then it happened. A low growl was the only warning before the bear lunged at Katie. The young woman froze, paralyzed by fear, as the bear barreled into her, knocking her to the ground. Claws raked across her back, shredding her jacket and tearing through her skin. She screamed a piercing sound that shattered any ounce of hope the crew still had. David clutched his camera instinctively, the lens capturing the horrific scene as the bear pinned Katie down. Blood pooled beneath her as the bear bit into her shoulder, shaking her like a rag doll. David shouted for the crew to run, his voice lost in the chaos. Katie's screams stopped abruptly as the bear tore into her throat, the wet sound of tearing flesh audible even over the commotion. David's cameraman, Jeff, dropped his gear and sprinted toward the forest, the others following in blind panic. The bear lifted its bloodied snout, its eyes glowing in the firelight, and gave chase. Jeff didn't make it far. He tripped over an exposed root, landing hard on the forest floor. The bear was on him instantly, its massive weight crushing his chest. It swiped at his face, disfiguring him in a single blow. Blood sprayed the moss-covered ground as Jeff's body convulsed beneath the predator's relentless assault. Emma, the team's sound technician, turned at the sound of Jeff's gurgled screams and stumbled backward. She crashed through the underbrush, her equipment clattering as she fell. She clawed at the ground, trying to pull herself up, but the bear was already there. Its jaws closed around her leg, snapping bone like a dry twig. She screamed, kicking at the beast with her free leg, but it dragged her deeper into the forest. David kept running, his chest heaving, his camera still clutched tightly in one hand. The forest seemed endless, the trees blurring together in the dim light. He tripped and fell, landing hard on his side. Pain shot through his ribs, but he forced himself up, adrenaline driving him forward. Behind him, the screams of his crew faded one by one, each cry silenced by the ruthless predator. He stumbled into a clearing and stopped, gasping for air. His heart pounded in his ears, his legs trembling. He realized he was alone. 6 of his crew had fallen, their lives claimed by the shadowy beast stalking the darkness. The bear reappeared, its silhouette massive against the tree line. Blood matted its fur, and its breath came in heavy snorts. It locked eyes with David and began to advance slowly and deliberately. David raised his camera, the lens focusing on the approaching beast. His hands trembled, but he was unable to look away. The bear roared a deep and primal sound that shook him. He backed away, his foot catching on a rock. He fell hard, the camera slipping from his grasp. The bear charged, closing the distance with terrifying speed. David scrambled backward, his hands clawing at the dirt. At the last moment, he spotted a narrow crevice between 2 boulders. He threw himself into the gap, the rocks scraping his arms and legs as he wedged himself inside. The bear reached the crevice, its claws swiping inches from David's face. He pressed deeper into the narrow space, his body shaking with fear. The bear roared again, pawing at the entrance. It tried to force its massive head inside but couldn't fit. Frustrated, it clawed at the rocks, dislodging dirt and debris. David held his breath, his heart pounding so loudly he thought it might give him away. Minutes passed like hours before the bear finally retreated, its growls fading into the distance. David remained in the crevice, too terrified to move. When he finally emerged, dawn broke, casting a pale light over the forest. The camp was unrecognizable. Tents were shredded, equipment scattered, and blood stained the ground. The bodies of his crew lay where they had fallen, torn apart by the relentless predator. David picked up his camera. The lens cracked, but still functional. Stumbling out of the valley, he carried the only evidence of the horror that had unfolded. Rangers found him hours later, disoriented and in shock. The footage recovered from his camera would later be used to piece together the events of that night. It showed the bear's raw power, the chaos of the attacks, and the moments of sheer terror as the crew fought for their lives. The documentary, released posthumously in honor of the victims, became a haunting testament to the dangers of the wilderness and the thin line between observer and prey. On March 18, 2024, the bustling streets of Tokyo's Suginami district continued as usual. It was a crisp spring morning, and the neighborhood hummed with life. Shops opened shutters, school children hurried to class, and vendors prepared for the day's business. Amid the city's controlled chaos, no one first noticed the intruder. The black bear had wandered from a forest reserve just outside the city limits, its massive frame blending into the shadows of alleyways. Hungry and disoriented, it followed the scent of food to a small family-owned market tucked between two apartment buildings. The bear pushed through the narrow entrance, knocking over produce baskets. The owner, an older man named Hiroshi, froze at the sight of the animal. The bear growled, swiping at a crate of apples, sending them tumbling across the floor. Customers screamed, abandoning their baskets as they bolted for the exit. In its frenzy, the bear overturned shelves and smashed jars of pickles and soy sauce, the pungent smell filling the air. Its claws raked against the wooden counter as it lunged at a fish display, devouring its contents in seconds. Outside, panic spread like wildfire. Locals shouted warnings, and parents dragged their children from the street. Pedestrians ducked into shops, slamming doors behind them as the bear emerged from the market, its fur glistening with spilled oil. Sirens wailed in the distance, but the bear lumbered onward, oblivious to the chaos it caused. Akiko Tanaka was returning home with a bag of groceries when she heard the commotion. She lived on the third floor of a modest apartment complex a few blocks away. Unaware of the bear's presence, she hurried through the building's narrow lobby, juggling her keys and shopping bag. The bear arrived moments later, its massive bulk blocking the entrance. It sniffed the air, catching the scent of food Akiko had carried in. With a low growl, it forced its way inside, the glass doors shattering under its weight. The sound echoed through the building, and Akiko turned just in time to see the animal charging up the stairs. Fear gripped her as she bolted for her apartment. Her hands shook as she unlocked the door, slamming it shut just as the bear reached her floor. She pressed her weight against the door, heart pounding as the animal clawed at the wood, its growls vibrating through the walls. The bear's claws splintered the door, and Akiko stumbled back as it forced its way inside. But the apartment was too small. There was nowhere for her to run. She backed into the kitchen, grabbed a chair, and swung it desperately. The bear batted it aside, its strength sending her crashing to the floor. It lunged, and Akiko scrambled into the bathroom, slamming the door shut. The bear roared, its claws gouging deep into the wood. Akiko's breathing was shallow, her body trembling as she pressed herself into the corner. Meanwhile, authorities arrived at the scene, their vehicles blocking off the street. Crowds had gathered outside, their phones capturing footage of the incident and instantly sharing it worldwide. Inside, the bear had moved on, leaving Akiko's apartment and roaming the complex. It smashed through another door on the second floor, startling a young couple watching the news. The man attempted to shield his partner, but the bear's sheer size and aggression overwhelmed them. Claw marks streaked the walls as the couple fled to the balcony, screaming for help. A tranquilizer team arrived, their weapons loaded and ready. However, the confined space of the apartment building made the operation risky. Every time the bear moved, it risked encountering more residents. The team carefully climbed the stairs, each creak of the steps adding to the tension. The bear had reached the top floor. It burst into another apartment, overturning furniture and ripping through curtains. A resident hiding in a closet clutched his phone, whispering updates to emergency services. The bear's snout pushed against the closet door, sniffing loudly before moving on. On the rooftop, the bear paused. The open space disorients it momentarily. It looked down at the street below, where flashing lights and a growing crowd awaited. For a brief moment, the city seemed to hold its breath. The tranquilizer team seized the opportunity. From a nearby building, a sharpshooter aimed and fired. The dart struck the bear's shoulder, but only enraged the animal. It roared, swiping at the air before charging toward the roof's edge. A second dart hit, then a third. The bear slowed, its movements growing sluggish as the tranquilizer took effect. Finally, it collapsed, its massive body sprawling across the rooftop. The tension broke and the crowd exhaled. Authorities quickly secured the animal, ensuring no further harm to residents or the bear. Still trembling in her bathroom, first responders escorted Akiko out of the building. Her face was pale, her hands clutching her sides as she tried to process the ordeal. She was treated for shock. The aftermath left the neighborhood shaken. The market was shattered, several apartments were destroyed, and fear lingered among Tokyo's citizens. News of the attack spread rapidly, especially since it was the first of its kind. The incident sparked debates about wildlife encroachment in urban areas. Experts cited habitat loss and a lack of food as reasons for the bear's unusual behavior. In the following weeks, measures were implemented to monitor wildlife near the city, and residents were educated on how to respond in similar situations. For Akiko, the memory of the bear's claws, tearing through her door, and its guttural growls haunted her long after the incident. She felt that the city could not protect her from nature's wrath. On October 3, 2023, the air in the Alaskan wilderness was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. A group of high school students from Anchorage, led by their teacher, Mr. Hale, were hiking through the dense national park. The trip was supposed to be educational, a chance to teach the teenagers about wildlife conservation while enjoying the beauty of the remote landscape. The students were a mix of energy and nerves, their chatter blending with the sounds of the forest. Some snapped photos of towering trees, while others marveled at distant snow-capped peaks. Their path wound gently upward, cutting through thick undergrowth and clusters of wildflowers. Unbeknownst to them, a grizzly bear was nearby, foraging in preparation for the long winter ahead. The bear, a massive creature with a thick coat that shimmered in the morning light, had been drawn to the area by the scent of berries and the occasional rustle of small animals. Its hunger made it irritable and unpredictable. The group reached a clearing at the base of the mountains. Mr. Hale paused to explain the importance of preserving habitats for animals like bears and moose. The students gathered around, some half listening while others admired the view. The bear appeared without warning. It emerged from the forest's edge, its hulking form blending with the shadows. At first, no one noticed. Then a student gasped, pointing toward the movement. Heads turned, and a wave of fear rippled through the group. The grizzly stood still, its eyes fixed on the teenagers. For a moment there was silence except for the bear's heavy breathing. Then it charged. The sudden movement sent the group into chaos. Students screamed, scattering in different directions as the bear rushed toward them. Mr. Hale shouted, his voice barely audible over the noise, trying to keep the group together. The bear's first target was Sarah, a quiet girl who lingered near the group's back. She froze, her eyes wide with terror as the massive animal closed the distance. It struck her with a single swipe of its paw, the force sending her sprawling onto the ground. The bear pounced, its jaws snapping inches from Sarah's face. Claws raked across her leg, leaving deep gashes that bled heavily. She screamed, kicking at the animal with what little strength she had. Eli, a tall and athletic boy, ran toward Sarah, desperately trying to help. He grabbed a branch from the ground and swung it at the bear, striking its side. The bear roared, turning its fury on him. Eli had no time to react. The grizzly lunged, its weight knocking him backward. He tried to shield himself with his arms, but the bear's claws tore through his jacket and into his flesh. Blood stained the ground as Eli struggled beneath the beast, his cries of pain piercing the air. Mr. Hale acted quickly. He reached into his pack, pulling out a flare gun. The device was standard for excursions into bear country but was never needed. He loaded the flare, his hands shaking, and fired into the air. The bright flash and loud bang startled the bear. It paused, its head whipping toward the noise. Mr. Hale grabbed a second flare and fired it closer, the sizzling light landing near the bear's feet. The grizzly reared onto its hind legs, its massive frame towering above them. It roared again, the sound vibrating through the clearing. For a moment it seemed to consider whether to continue its attack. Then it dropped to all fours and retreated into the forest. The clearing was eerily quiet. The scattered students began to emerge, their faces pale and their breaths shallow. Some were crying while others clung to each other, their bodies trembling. Mr. Hale rushed to Sarah and Eli, who lay on the ground, blood pooling beneath them. Sarah was conscious but weak, her face contorted in pain as she clutched her injured leg. Eli was worse off, his arms and chest covered in deep wounds. His breathing was labored, and his eyes fluttered as he struggled to stay awake. The teacher barked orders, his calm demeanor helping his students stay focused. He instructed the students to apply pressure to the wounds using their jackets while he radioed for help. The signal was weak, but after several tense minutes, he managed to relay their location to park rangers. Time dragged on as the group waited. Mr. Hale watched the forest, his flare gun ready in case the bear returned. Every rustle of leaves made the students flinch, their fear etched on their faces. When the rangers arrived, they worked quickly to stabilize Sarah and Eli. They praised Mr. Hale for his quick thinking, noting that the flares had likely saved the entire group. The injured students were loaded onto stretchers and carried down the trail to waiting ambulances. The news of the attack spread quickly, shocking the community. Although encounters with bears were not unheard of in Alaska, incidents during field trips were rare. Parents demanded answers, questioning whether enough precautions had been taken to protect their children. For the students who had witnessed the attack, the memories lingered. Sarah underwent multiple surgeries to repair her leg, while Eli faced a long recovery from his injuries. Both credited Mr. Hale's bravery for saving their lives, calling him a hero. In the aftermath, the school and park authorities reviewed their protocols and implemented stricter guidelines for trips into bear territory. The incident became a grim reminder of the wilderness's unpredictable nature and the need for constant vigilance. The events of that day remained on Mr. Hale's mind. He replayed the attack, questioning whether he could have protected his students more. Despite the praise he received, the weight of what had happened stayed with him. On June 21, 2024, the Aurora, a small research vessel charting the icy waters off Norway's Arctic islands, bobbed gently near a remote, uninhabited shore. The vessel's mission was scientific, a study of the region's ecosystem and the impact of climate change on Arctic wildlife. The crew of 6, led by marine biologist Dr. Elise Sandstrom, had been hard at work for days, cataloging marine life and collecting samples. That afternoon, they decided to dock on the shore for a short break and to examine the tundra vegetation. The landscape was stark and beautiful. Above, the midnight sun hung low on the horizon, casting an otherworldly glow. The crew, bundled in heavy jackets against the Arctic chill, moved with caution and curiosity. Unbeknownst to them, they were not alone. A gaunt and disoriented bear wandered nearby. It had been driven far from its usual hunting grounds, and its desperation had dulled its natural fear of humans. The bear caught their scent as the crew spread across the shore. Its black nose twitched, and its eyes narrowed. Mark Jensen, the ship's mechanic, was the first to notice the bear. He had wandered slightly ahead of the group, camera in hand, snapping pictures of the icy shoreline. He froze mid-step, gazing at the hulking white figure emerging from behind a ridge. The bear stood still for a moment. Then it moved. Slowly at first, its paws crunched softly against the ice, then faster. Its powerful frame closed the distance between itself and the crew. Mark shouted a warning, his voice cutting through the cold air. The rest of the team turned, their expressions shifting from confusion to horror as they spotted the bear. Dr. Sandstrom motioned for everyone to retreat toward the Aurora, but the bear had already picked up speed. Realizing the immediate danger, Mark fumbled with the flare gun strapped to his belt. He loaded a flare and fired it into the air. The bright flash startled the bear momentarily, and it stopped, its head snapping toward the fiery light, but hunger and desperation outweighed the fear. With a guttural roar, the bear charged. Mark didn't have time to react. The bear slammed into him with the force of a freight train, knocking him to the ground. His body hit the ice with a sickening thud, and the flare gun skittered out of his hand. The bear reared up, its claws gleaming in the dim light, and brought them down in a brutal swipe across Mark's torso. Blood sprayed onto the ice as Mark screamed, his voice raw and ragged. He tried to shield himself, but he could do nothing to stop the attack. The animal's claws raked his arms and chest, and its jaws snapped dangerously close to his head. The rest of the crew sprang into action. Dr. Sandstrom grabbed an emergency flare from her pack and fired it at the bear's flank. The burning light struck the animal, causing it to flinch and back away. Another crew member, Hans Larsen, swung a metal pole, yelling and banging it against the rocks to create as much noise as possible. The bear hesitated, fighting desperation and instinct. It growled, its breath visible in the frigid air, and stepped back. The crew used the momentary reprieve to drag Mark away from the immediate danger. Blood pooled beneath him, staining the pristine ice. As the bear circled, the crew formed a defensive line to assess whether to renew its attack. They wielded whatever they could find: poles, flares, even rocks. The bear roared again, its frustration palpable, but the combined noise and bright lights finally drove it back. It retreated slowly, its massive form disappearing over the ridge. The danger had passed, but the aftermath was grim. Mark lay motionless, his breathing shallow and labored. His jacket and shirt were shredded, revealing deep gashes that oozed blood. His face was pale and his eyes fluttered weakly. Dr. Sandstrom took charge, her calm demeanor masking the situation's urgency. The crew applied pressure to Mark's wounds and wrapped him in thermal blankets to stave off shock. Hans radioed the Aurora, informing the remaining crew on board of the emergency. Getting Mark back to the vessel was a harrowing task. The icy terrain made every step treacherous, and Mark's condition worsened with each passing minute. When they reached the Aurora, his pulse was faint, and his skin had taken on a grayish hue. The crew stabilized Mark as best they could, administering painkillers and fluids. Meanwhile, Hans contacted the mainland, relaying their coordinates and requesting an emergency airlift. The response was swift. A rescue helicopter was dispatched from a nearby town, but the Arctic's unpredictable weather complicated the mission. Winds picked up, and visibility worsened as a sudden fog rolled in. The crew huddled around Mark, their faces grim with worry. When the helicopter finally arrived, the sound of its rotors slicing through the air was a welcome relief. Mark was carefully loaded onto a stretcher and hoisted aboard, along with Dr. Sandstrom, who insisted on accompanying him. The helicopter disappeared into the fog, leaving the Aurora and its remaining crew in tense silence. Mark survived the ordeal, but the injuries left him scarred, both physically and mentally. After the attack, experts noted that bears, once confined to sea ice, were venturing further inland in search of food, bringing them closer to humans. The crew of the Aurora returned to Norway shaken but determined to share their story. Their encounter showed the consequences of a changing planet. Mark's memories of that day remained vivid. The sound of the bear's growl, the sharp pain of its claws, and the desperate fight for survival haunted his dreams. Yet he also felt gratitude for his crew's quick actions and sheer will to survive. On April 11, 2024, the morning sun bathed the Indian Himalayas in a soft, golden glow as three backpackers, Samir, Leela, and Anil, pushed forward along a remote trekking route. They had chosen this path precisely for its isolation, eager to experience the untouched beauty of the mountains away from the usual crowds. The towering peaks surrounded them, their snow-capped tips piercing the sky. Beneath the peaks, dense pine and oak forests spread like a dark green blanket. The trio was in high spirits, enjoying the crisp air and the promise of discovery. Their backpacks were laden with essentials, and their trekking poles rhythmically struck the ground. They were about to descend into a secluded valley when the atmosphere shifted. The forest grew quieter, as if holding its breath. The birdsong faded, leaving an eerie stillness that prickled the backs of their necks. Samir, leading the group, paused mid-step, scanning the dense undergrowth ahead. Leela and Anil stopped behind him, sensing his unease. Then the sound came. A low, guttural growl, deep and menacing. From the shadowy thicket, a Himalayan brown bear emerged. It was massive, its thick coat blending into the earthy tones of the forest. The bear's small eyes locked onto the group, its ears pinned back. It wasn't just watching, it was sizing them up. The bear's movements were deliberate as it stepped forward, claws clicking against the stones. The hikers froze, their breaths shallow. His instincts kicked in, and Samir began to back away slowly, gesturing for the others to do the same. But the bear wasn't retreating. It huffed loudly, stomping the ground, a clear warning. The hikers had unknowingly ventured too close to its territory. Before they could act further, the bear let out a deafening roar and charged. Samir bolted toward a large rock formation nearby, hoping to climb to safety. The bear, however, was faster. Its powerful limbs propelled it forward with terrifying speed. Samir had barely reached the base of the rock when the bear struck him with a swipe of its massive paw. The force sent him sprawling to the ground, his scream cutting through the still air. Leela and Anil watched in horror as the bear loomed over Samir, its jaws snapping inches from his face. Blood stained the ground where Samir lay, clutching his shoulder where the bear had struck. Trembling but desperate, Leela grabbed her trekking pole and shouted to draw the bear's attention. Anil followed her lead, waving his pole and banging it against a rock. The bear rose onto its hind legs, towering over them, its sharp teeth bared in a feral snarl. The hikers and the bear stood locked in a deadly standoff momentarily. Leela advanced cautiously, gripping her pole tightly. She swung it with all her strength, striking the bear's side. The animal flinched, letting out a guttural roar, but didn't back down. Instead, it lunged at her. She barely had time to react, thrusting the pole forward to keep the bear at bay. The pole struck its snout, stopping its advance for a second. Anil seized the opportunity to pull Samir away from the immediate danger. He grabbed his injured friend under the arms and dragged him toward the rocks. Samir groaned in pain, his face pale and drenched in sweat, but he managed to stagger to his feet with Anil's help. Enraged, the bear turned its attention back to Leela. With one massive paw, it swiped at her, catching her backpack. The impact spun her around, and she stumbled hard onto the rocky ground. The bear loomed over her, its breath hot and rank, its growl vibrating through her chest. Anil, desperate, grabbed a large rock and hurled it at the bear. The stone struck its shoulder, and the bear let out a pained roar. It turned sharply, glaring at Anil with deadly intent. Leela scrambled backward, her hands scraping against the rough terrain as she tried to distance herself from the beast. The bear advanced toward Anil, who continued to throw whatever he could find: rocks, branches, even his water bottle. Each strike seemed to infuriate the bear further, but also bought precious seconds. After recovering from her fall, Leela fumbled for a flare in her pack. Her hands trembled as she lit it, the bright flame bursting to life. She waved it in the air, the acrid smoke stinging her eyes. The bear hesitated, its fear of fire overriding its aggression momentarily. The hikers seized the chance. Leela moved to help Anil support Samir, who was barely conscious. Blood seeped through his jacket, leaving a trail behind them as they retreated. The bear growled, but remained distant, watching them with predatory eyes. Their descent was grueling. The narrow trail, littered with loose rocks and roots, made every step treacherous. Samir's weight slowed them down, and his labored breathing grew weaker with each passing minute, but they couldn't leave him behind. Leela kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting the bear to reappear. When they finally reached the lower valley, they collapsed near a stream. Leela and Anil tended to Samir as best they could, using their limited supplies to bandage his wounds. His shoulder and chest bore deep gashes, and his face was pale from blood loss. But it wasn't over. They weren't safe yet. They still had miles to go before reaching the nearest village where they could find help. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a branch, kept their nerves on edge, fearing the bear's return. Hours later, they stumbled into the village. Exhausted and battered, locals quickly sprang into action, calling for medical assistance and tending to the injured hikers. Samir was rushed to the nearest hospital, where doctors worked tirelessly to stabilize him. News of the attack spread quickly because it was so unusual. Experts pointed to the increasing encroachment of human activity into bear habitats as a likely cause. The Himalayan brown bear, already under pressure from habitat loss and dwindling food sources, was becoming more unpredictable. The deafening roar of the bear, the glint of its razor-sharp claws catching the light, and the crushing weight of helplessness in those terrifying moments etched themselves permanently into Leela and Anil's memories. For years, the echoes of that fateful encounter would haunt their dreams, a chilling reminder of nature's raw power. Samir's survival defied all odds, a testament to sheer will and luck. Yet his deep scars, both physical and emotional, served as an enduring symbol of life's fragility in the unforgiving wild. The experience bonded them in shared trauma, forever changing the way they viewed the delicate balance between humanity and the natural world.